and gentlemen, welcome to our weekly Parsha Shiur, our weekly Thursday morning Parsha Shiur. I want to begin by reminding you that next week, Thursday, with Hashem's help, we are going to be celebrating the Yom Tov of Purim. And on Purim morning, we are not going to have our weekly Thursday morning Parsha Shiur. So I won't see you for this Shiur next week, but with Hashem's help, we'll see you in 2 weeks' time. This Shabbos is Parshas Vayikra. And being the Shabbos before Purim, we also read Parsha Zachar. Parsha Zachar comes along with a special Haftarah, telling the famous story of King Shaul, who was instructed by Hashem through the prophet Shmuel to annihilate the entire nation of Amalek. Shaul does not exactly fulfill the words of Hashem. And actually, the reason why we read this, the Shabbos before Purim, is because it is Shaul's incomplete fulfillment of Hashem's instructions, because he doesn't truly and completely annihilate the nation of Amalek. That is actually how we end up with a Haman many generations, many hundreds of years later, and giving us the story of Purim. I thought that for today, instead of studying insights from the Parsha as we usually do, we can discuss some of the commentary and some of the insights that our rabbis give us in the Megillah, because there are many and they are so beautiful and so nuanced, and some of them very famous and some of them much less famous, and so perhaps we can discuss some of them today. So instead of studying the Parsha, we'll study the Megillah. I'm going to begin in the beginning of the 3rd chapter. So in the 3rd chapter of the Megillah, of the 10 chapters of the Megillah, in the 3rd one, the Torah, the Megillah, goes directly to the heart of the story. The king Achashverosh promotes a man named Haman. He promotes him. The Torah says that he places his position above all of the other ministers who are with him. And all the king's servants that are at the gate of the king are all literally bowing down and prostrating themselves to Haman. For so the king has instructed. The Torah does not tell us why the king promotes Haman to such a high stature. All right, the commentaries have much to say on this, but the Torah doesn't say why. The Torah just says that Haman gets this incredible promotion, and the king instructs everybody to bow down to Haman. Now, at this point, the Torah does not declare that Haman is any form of an anti-Semite. Of course, he is an anti-Semite, but the Torah doesn't say that. The Torah doesn't tell us that he's out to get the Jews. Nothing of that. In fact, that's not the way the Torah presents the story. What the Torah does say is that there's one man who refuses to obey the instruction of the king and bow before Haman. Mordechai, in the words of the pasuk, and Mordechai lo yichra v'lo yishtachave, does not kneel and does not bow. So he's approached by the servants of the king, by Achashverosh's servants, all of whom are bowing down to Haman, and Mordechai is asked point blank why he is refusing to obey the instruction of the king. The Torah does not tell us immediately what Mordechai responds to this, but just that he was approached repeatedly, yom v'yom. Mordechai was approached day in, day out. People were insisting that he bow down to Haman, but Mordechai refuses to obey. And then the Torah says these words, quote, Perek Gimel Pasuk Dalet, Vayagidu laHaman. Now these people who were trying to get Mordechai to bow down to Haman, they report to Haman, Lirois, to see, Hayamdu divrei Mordechai, if Mordechai's words would hold up, if Mordechai's words were in fact true. Ki higid lohem asher hu Yehudi, because Mordechai had told them, this is the simple meaning of the verse, because Mordechai had told them that he was Jewish. And again, the simple understanding is that he told them that he was Jewish, and that is the reason why he cannot bow down to Haman. So this is reported back to Haman to see if this will stand. In other words, if Haman will accept Mordechai's refusal to bow down to him by virtue and the basis of the fact that Mordechai is a Jew. And then the Torah says something very strange. The Torah says, Vayar Haman, it is only at that point that Haman sees ki ein Mordechai kaireya u'mishtacha v'loy, that Mordechai is not kneeling or bowing down to him. Vayimolei Haman chema, Haman becomes filled with anger. Vayivez be'enov, he was too cheap in his eyes just to take revenge against the nation of Mordechai. Quote, ki higidu layes am Mordechai, because they tell him the nation of Mordechai. Again, the simple understanding is that they tell Haman that Mordechai refuses to bow down by virtue of the fact that he's a Jew. And therefore, at this point, the Torah tells us that Haman seeks, Rahman al-Islam, to annihilate all the Jews in all of the kings, in all of the provinces of the king Achashverosh, the nation of Mordechai. And here the commentaries struggle with there's many parts to the story which seem difficult to understand. Again, the Torah doesn't come out of the gate and tell us that Haman was a bloodthirsty anti-Semite who wishes to annihilate the Jews. Instead, the Torah tells us that Mordechai refuses to bow down. When the people insist that Mordechai bows down and insist repeatedly, Mordechai doesn't listen to them, and they inform Haman to see whether Mordechai's words would prevail, whether Mordechai's words will last, because they tell him, Ki higid lohem asher hu Yehudi. Okay, so what's difficult to understand here is like this. Number one, the commentaries make it clear that the rest of the Jews did bow down to Haman. It was only Mordechai who refused to bow. Mordechai lo yichrav lo yishtachave. Other Jews bowed down to Mordechai. Were they allowed to bow down to Mordechai? Other Jews bowed down to Haman. Were they allowed to bow down to Haman? Were they not allowed to bow down to Haman? Akasha, a good question. But the reality is that they did, probably because they were keenly aware, correctly, that their own lives were at stake if they didn't bow down to Haman, so they bowed. The only one who refused is Mordechai. So why is Haman, again, you can say that Haman was an anti-Semite, and the Torah does say that later, but it doesn't say that at the beginning. In the beginning, it just says that Haman is upset that Mordechai isn't bowing down to him. So why is Haman upset at the entire Jewish nation? If everybody else is bowing down, there's only one individual, Mordechai, so kill Mordechai. What do you want from everybody else? Question number one. Question number two, they repeat the words of Haman they repeat the words of Mordechai to Haman, Vayagidu Haman, Leroy Sayamdu Divrei Mordechai, to see whether these words have validity, whether they'll stand, because he told them that he was Jewish. So this is incredibly difficult to understand. What is it that Mordechai had told them that they were trying to see if it had any validity? Hayamdu divrei Mordechai, whether Mordechai's words will stand. What exactly was so surprising by the words of Mordechai that they wanted to ask Haman if Mordechai's words will stand? They didn't know that Mordechai was Jewish. They knew Mordechai was Jewish. Everybody knew Mordechai was Jewish. The Megillah presents him as the one person in the entire city of Shushan who stood out in the most obvious way as a Jew. Ish Yehudi hoya b'Shushan abira. Everybody knew he was Jewish. They knew he wasn't bowing down because Mordechai made no secret of that. So why does the Megillah say that they're running to Haman to see if Mordechai's words stand? It's like they're trying to figure out if Mordechai is telling the truth when he tells them that he's Jewish. First of all, why are they doubting it? And if they are doubting it, why is Haman the one to decide whether Mordechai is Jewish or not? And then again, later on, when the Megillah describes Haman's own anti-Semitism and his desire to wipe out the Jewish people, it says, Ki higidu layas am Mordechai. Why is Haman not satisfied with annihilating and killing just Mordechai? Ki higidu layas am Mordechai, because they've told him the nation of Mordechai. And therefore he wants to wipe out all the Jews. It seems like the Megillah should have just said much simply and much more straightforward that Mordechai refused to bow down to Haman by virtue of him being Jewish. This incited Haman's anti-Semitism, and therefore he decided to annihilate the Jews. There's obviously much more here to the story. Okay, so to explain this, there is an explanation here from the Chasam Sofer. I want to say that when I studied this, when I read this for the first time in the name of the Chasam Sofer, my mouth kind of hit the floor just because of how shocking this interpretation is. But yet it turned, I read it, I studied it in a sefer called Tamei HaMinhagim, which goes through the reasons for many different minhagim that Jews had, brought down in the name of the Chasam Sofer. And it turns out it's not only the Chasam Sofer, not the only one who says this, but anyways, I studied it in his name. And it's really, I think it's a surprising, almost troubling, but when you think about it, very illuminating interpretation. Okay. So here it is. Let's take a step back. There's a very, very famous commentary from the Medrash, which relates in great detail that Mordechai and Haman had a history together. They knew each other from before the story of Purim. Mordechai and Haman knew each other from before the story of Purim. What's the story? Again, you can look this up in the Medrash. The Medrash writes this with tremendous amount of detail. The story of Purim begins in the third year of the rule of Achashverosh. Esther actually only becomes queen in the 7th year of the rule of Achashverosh, which is really when the story kind of kicks into high gear. The Medrash relates that in the 2nd year of the rule of Achashverosh, Achashverosh had a war that he was waging. The Medrash actually gives the name of the particular province where he was waging the war. I forgot the name of the province, but he's waging there's a battle line. Achashverosh is fighting a war. Again, by the time the story of the Megillah happens, B'shnat Sholosh L'Molchoi, in the 3rd year, Achashverosh is already ruling 127 lands, and he's already reigning supreme. But a year before the opening verses of the Megillah, in the 2nd year, Achashverosh he's got battles. He's got battles he has to fight. Battles are fought with armies. Armies are led by generals. Among Achashverosh's generals was Haman and Mordechai. Each one led their own platoon of soldiers. Haman led his platoon, and Mordechai led his platoon. Very famous Medrash. Haman and his men were not self-disciplined with their provisions, and so they ran out of bread and water and other provisions, and the lives of him and his men and the soldiers who were with him were in danger, and this was directly because of negligence on Haman's part. Mordechai, on the other hand, was incredibly disciplined with his men, and they had plenty of provision, no problem. So Haman approached Mordechai. One general approaches the other. Haman approaches Mordechai and asks to purchase some of Mordechai's provisions so that he can have bread and water and the things that he needs for his men. And Mordechai agrees to sell. Haman does not ask for them as a gift. Haman wants to buy them. Mordechai agrees to sell them to him, but not for money. Not for money. Instead, Mordechai, obviously through Ruach HaKodesh, through prophecy, can see that him and Haman are going to have an interesting. They're going to have an interesting future. So Mordechai says to Haman, "I'll sell you the food, the provisions, on the condition that you, Haman, sell yourself to me, Mordechai, as a slave." Haman agrees. They write up a document. They write it at the bottom of Mordechai's shoe. Haman scratches himself, writes it actually with his own blood. "I, Haman, the son of Hamdasa, sell myself as a slave to you, Mordechai, in exchange for the provisions." The bottom of the shoe is signed by both Haman and Mordechai. Mordechai keeps the shoe in a safe place so he can use this document as proof. Haman receives the provisions for himself and his men, and off they go. All right. This part of the Medrash is very famous. Later on in the Megillah, Haman actually tells his family that, quote, "Every time I see Mordechai," he complains to his family. He says, "I'm so wealthy, I'm so famous, I'm so successful, right? I have such a large family, I have so much money, I have so much power, I have so much fame, I have so much political capital." Haman, of course, is more shrewd than Achashverosh, or at least this is This is the way Achashverosh chooses to present himself, right? And so he successfully is able to manipulate Achashverosh. He's the most powerful man in the world. And Haman actually says in the Megillah, he tells his family, whenever I see Mordechai, everything I have is worthless. And the commentaries point out, Haman doesn't say, it feels worthless. Haman says, every time I see Mordechai, it is worthless. Why is it all worthless? Well, the answer is because he was legally and halachically Mordechai's slave. So everything a slave owns, of course, by right, goes straight to his master. So everything that he owned was really, by extension, owned by Mordechai, who was actually legally and halachically his owner. That's why he tells them, every time I see Mordechai, everything I have is worthless. And gives us, I guess, also some psychological insight into why Mordechai is refusing to bow down to Haman. In other words, or what he's being asked to do. He's being asked to bow down to his own slave. The Medrash goes so far as to say that every time Haman would walk by, Mordechai would raise his foot, put on the shoe, that famous shoe in which Haman had sold himself as a slave, and raise it so Haman would see it as he would walk by, reminding him of his true place in his relationship with Mordechai. This is the Medrash. Comes the Chasam Sofer and drops a bomb. The Chasam Sofer says there's a halacha called Evad Kanani. Evad Kanani means in biblical times, in the times of the Beis HaMikdash, there was a biblical law, there was a mitzvah that says that a Jew was able to take possession of a non-Jewish slave called an Evad Kanani. However, the Torah teaches us that when the Jew takes possession of this Evad Kanani, when the Jew takes possession of this individual, of this goy that he's now making into his own slave, which he's going to own forever and biblically forbidden to free, actually the Torah tells us that the Jew acquiring the slave, in order to make the slave his, he actually has to convert the slave. He has to convert him to Judaism. Now, to be fair, it's a different type of conversion. It's a different form of conversion than the conversion we know of today, because conversion today is only works if the convert is willing to convert, obviously. And even if the convert is willing to convert, we still try to discourage them. With an Evad Kanani, it's not a conversion out of consent. It's conversion whether the Evad likes it or not. But part of the Torah makes it clear, part of the process of acquiring an Evad Kanani, of acquiring this non-Jewish slave, is actually converting them. So the slave would be put in the mikveh. They would be forced or informed that they're now obligated in some of the mitzvahs. And if it was a male slave, he'd be given a bris, he'd be given circumcision. An Evad Kanani, I don't want to get lost in the details here, but an Evad Kanani is obligated in the vast majority of mitzvahs. Even as an Evad, the vast majority of mitzvahs. There are 365 negative commandments. The Evad Kanani is obligated to keep all 365. There are many mitzvahs that are called positive mitzvahs, are called she'ein hazman groma, not time-bound mitzvahs. The Evad Kanani is obligated in those. In short, all the mitzvahs, just like all the mitzvahs that women are obligated in, as a rule, an Evad Kanani is obligated in these mitzvahs as well. Says the Chasam Sofer, when the Medrash says that Mordechai acquired Haman as a slave, and Haman sold himself as a slave to Mordechai, it wasn't just a legal contractual deal between them. Mordechai made Haman his Evad Kanani. He gave him the halachic legal status of an Evad Kanani. He toiveled him in the mikveh. He gave him a bris milah, and he told him, "You're now obligated to fulfill mitzvahs, as many mitzvahs as halachically, biblically, women are obligated to fulfill." Now it gets even better. What's the halacha if a Jew liberates his Evad Kanani? Which again, as a rule, biblically, you're not allowed to do. But what's the din if the Jew does it anyways? He takes his Evad Kanani and he gives him a document and he says, you're now liberated and free. The halacha is that at that point, the Evad Kanani's status as a Jew becomes complete. An Evad Kanani who's been freed, even if he was forced into freedom, is now 100% Jewish. Even if his master dies, even if his Jewish master dies, and for whatever reason there's no other Jew to inherit him, there's no other Jew to take possession over him, once the Evad Kanani is no longer under the servitude of a Jew, the Evad Kanani becomes a full-fledged Yid. You can count him as a minyan. You can, you can count him as a minyan, and if he's a man, he becomes obligated in all the mitzvahs like a man. Again, I don't want to get too carried away with the details here, but the Gemara says that there was one of the sages of the Mishnah who once came to shul with his own Evad Kanani, and they had 9 men, and they needed a minyan. And they were waiting, and the 10th man didn't come, and he turned around and he freed his slave, and he made him a complete Jew so that they could count him as part of a minyan. And the Gemara asks, how can you do that? You're not allowed to free an Evad Kanani. And the Gemara says, for the sake of a mitzvah like davening with a minyan, it was permissible. And he did it. Says the Chasam Sofer, Haman was an Evad Kanani, which is an amazing insight, because again, Haman is a descendant of Amalek. We're obligated to eradicate and annihilate the descendants of Amalek. Chasam Sofer. The Chasam Sofer says Mordechai took Haman and he converted him and he made him a Yid at least as much as an Evad Kanani is. And according to this Chasam Sofer, were Haman to succeed and Rahman al-Islam annihilate the entire Jewish nation, Haman himself, would halachically be considered a full-fledged Yid. Okay. Before I explain what the significance of this is, in other words, why is this so? What do we do with this vort? What do we do with this insight? Before I explain how we apply it, I want to go back to the verses and just show you how the Chasam Sofer learns these verses. So let's go back to the verses in the Megillah. Mordechai refuses to bow down to Haman, and the people come to him day in, day out, and they tell him, why? Why are you transgressing the commandment of the king? The king says everybody has to bow down to Haman. Mordechai tells them something, and they run back to Haman to see if it's true. Now listen to these words. Vayagidu lo Haman, the people come back to Haman. Lirois hayamdu divrei Mordechai. They're flabbergasted by what they hear. They come running to Mordechai, they come running to Haman and they say, is this true? The words of Mordechai, are they true? Why are they so surprised by what Mordechai is saying? Ki higid lohem asher hu Yehudi. Because Mordechai has told them that he is a Jew. Says the Chasam Sofer, who's a Jew? Mordechai doesn't say Higid Lahem Mordechai Asher Ani Yehudi. Mordechai didn't say I can't bow down because I'm a Jew. That's not what Mordechai said. He didn't have to tell them. Everybody knew that already. Higid Lahem Asher Hu Yehudi means Mordechai told them that Haman is a Jew. Halachically, and Evad Kanani. This made their heads spin like they've never spun before. They ran back to Haman and they said, you are also a Jew. Says the pasuk. Vayar Haman ki ein Mordechai kaireya mishtachav eloi. Haman sees that Mordechai is not bowing down to him, not just because Mordechai is a Jew, because Mordechai is telling everybody who Haman really is. He's uncovered and he's revealed Haman's identity. Vayimolei Haman chema, the secret is out. Haman's own identity is revealed. Now Haman becomes angry. If Mordechai would have quietly just not bowed down, Haman would leave him alone. But now that he revealed the truth about Haman, Haman became furious. But he can't just kill Mordechai. You see, because as a slave owned by a Yid, the halacha is even if the slave were to kill his master, in this case, Haman were to kill Mordechai, his position as a slave would just be transferred to another Jew, and another Jew, and another Jew. And so Haman finds himself without having a choice. He's embarrassed just to kill Mordechai because it's not going to help him. Even if he kills Mordechai, he'll then be a slave of Mordechai's children, or Mordechai's brothers, or Mordechai's cousins, as is the law halachically when it comes to inheritance. And so he decides he has to wipe out the entire Jewish nation. But how does the Megillah refer to the Jewish nation? Am Mordechai, the nation of Mordechai. Haman decides he has no choice; he has to kill them all. Okay, and from there, the story of the Megillah unfolds until eventually Haman, the descendant of Amalek, meets his own downfall together with all the other anti-Semites and enemies of the Jews. Let me tell you, the insight of the Chasam Sofer is left there. It's left at that point. But let me tell you why I think this is significant. Again, let me tell you how I think we can apply this to ourselves. What's the Chasam Sofer really saying? What he's saying is that Haman had halachically this limbo, this in transition status as a Jew. So who in the end, based on this insight of Chasam Sofer, who in the end is responsible for this danger posed to the Jewish people in the days of Haman? In a sense, it was one of our own. It turns out that the decree, the danger being posed to the Jewish nation, comes from within the Jewish nation. And once again, like with the Erev Rav, and like with so many other stories in Chumash and in Torah and in Mishnah and in Gemara, we're back to the same point. And the same point is that sometimes, or very often, without realizing, we empower our own enemies. It's the Torah's way of saying if we were strong enough within ourselves, this would have never happened. I remember studying, the Medrash talks about the 6 days of creation. And the Medrash says that God created trees, millions. Well, the Torah doesn't say millions, but Hashem created trees on the face of the earth. I mean, there are millions and millions of trees. And then the Medrash says at some point, the trees become aware that Hashem has created steel in the world. This chemical, this material called steel. And all the trees of the world, all the trees of the forest begin to tremble when they see the steel, when they see metal. And they complain to Hashem and they say, Ribono Shel Olam, you've created something that has the power to annihilate us and wipe us all out. You've created steel. Steel, from a steel you make an axe. From an axe you use to chop down a tree. And the Medrash says that the Ribono Shel Olam turns to the steel and says, you respond. And the steel says to the trees, you're afraid of me? You're afraid of the metal part of the axe that chops down the tree? What's the handle of the axe made out of? It's made out of wood. Where does the wood come from? Where does the wood come from? The wood comes from you. Don't give me a handle and I won't chop you down. It's not me you should be afraid of, says the steel to the trees. It's yourself. It's not me in the end who chops you down. It's you who empower me to chop you down. It's not me who destroys you. It's you who destroys yourself. And that in a deeper sense is what the Chasam Sofer is saying. He's turning to a Jew who studies the Megillah and says, make no mistake. There'll be a Haman in every generation. The Rebbeinu Shalom will always save us. That's not where the danger comes from. You know where the danger comes from? When the Jews empower the anti-Semites. When the Jews within themselves look at themselves and feel weak and insecure and feel a need to apologize and defend themselves and justify their existence and, I'm sorry, I'm here, I hope I'm not in your way. Please, let me bow down to you, Haman, so that you won't be upset with me. At that point, Haman emerges and says, I'm going to annihilate and seeks to annihilate the Jews. But scratch the surface, says the Chasam Sofer. Underneath, you'll discover that the danger is really coming from within the Jewish nation themselves. Reminds us of that famous teaching of the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov says, people think that after 120, when the soul goes upstairs, it stands before a heavenly tribunal, and the heavenly tribunal will judge the soul. Says the Baal Shem Tov, that's not what happens. The heavenly tribunal does not judge the soul. The heavenly tribunal are angels, and angels are weaker and spiritually lower than souls. They can't. So who judges the soul? Says the Baal Shem Tov, the soul judges itself. The heavenly tribunal has only one ability: to, so to speak, deceive the soul and get it to pass judgment on the life of an individual that the neshama thinks is someone else, but it's really itself. And that, says the Baal Shem Tov, is what's waiting for all of us after 120 years, please God, plus tax. We'll come upstairs, and it's in some form, some way, the Rebbeinu Shalom, the heavenly Bezdin, will look at the soul and say, we're going to say nothing. You talk. You tell us, what do you think about yourself? You tell us the truth. Don't tell me what other people think. Don't tell me what other people said about you. Not important. You tell us the truth. And the moment a person starts to talk, Mahu Omer, the truth of how they see themselves emerges. And Bezdin Shalmal, the heavenly tribunal, says, we accept what you say, no matter what you say. The way you see yourself, ultimately that becomes the way others see you. Even Haman, the Torah gives us no explanation for how or why he became so powerful. The Chasam Sofer says, you know why? Because he was an Evad Kanani, connected to the Jewish people. And his anti-Semitic advances are seen in a spiritual sense as the Jews' own spiritual, as part of the Jews' own spiritual struggle and journey to find their place, to find their identity, and to be strong enough as Jews. And when they do, the decree is nullified. All right, that's insight number one. Next, insight number two. This one comes from Levi Yitzchok of Berditchev, and it's just an absolute gem. Levi Yitzchok of Berditchev addresses what is perhaps one of the most difficult to understand parts of the structure of the story of the Megillah. The most famous part of the story of the Megillah is the way Haman is forced by the king Achashverosh to parade Mordechai around in the streets on the royal horse, dressed in the royal garments. As Haman screams throughout the city of Shushan, so shall be done to a man upon whom the king seeks to bestow honor. Okay. In fact, many Megillas of Purim have that picture on the front of the Megillah, the image of Mordechai, with the image of Mordechai sitting on the horse, the image of Haman leading him, with the reins, of course, the famous garbage can on Haman's head, which was tossed by his daughter, etc., etc. And all the commentaries ask a very simple question. They all say, actually, if you read the story, if you study the structure of the story of Purim, the part about Haman parading Mordechai around the city on a horse actually is completely non-consequential. It actually makes no difference. The Jews are just in as much danger after the Mordechai is paraded around on the horse as they were before. Nothing changed. The decree is still in effect. Haman is still the most powerful man in the world. Actually, it doesn't change anything. In fact, when it's over, Haman goes back Haman goes back home, complains to his family, and from there he's taken back to the palace for the second meal with Achashverosh and Esther. How are the Jewish people saved in the end? In the end, at the second party that Esther makes for Achashverosh and Haman, she tells the king that she's Jewish. She tells the king that Mordechai, that Haman is an anti-Semite and wants to annihilate all the Jewish people, and all the events that follow. And the king is told that Haman is trying to kill Mordechai, even though Mordechai saved the king's life, etc. And Haman is hung, and from there things go from there. But just the isolated event of Mordechai being paraded around on the horse, with all of its beautiful irony, right? Here's the man leading the horse who sentenced the man on the horse to death, and his entire people. It's a beautiful scene, right? Jewish pride. It's wonderful, but actually, it's at least on the literal level, it seems completely irrelevant. It doesn't seem to have any impact at all. Nothing changes because of that. Not one Jewish life is saved because of that. Not the decree is not abolished because of that. Nothing. Haman's position is not weakened because of that. Mordechai's position is not strengthened because of that. Nothing changes. They go back afterwards basically to the way they were before, and the Jewish people are still sentenced to death on the 13th day of Adar. So the commentaries all talk about this. Like, why does the Megillah make such a big deal out of this? So here there is an insight from Levi Yitzchok of Berditchev, and it's classic Hasidic style. Classic. Says Levi Yitzchok of Berditchev, you have to pay attention to the verses. When the decree of Haman and Mordechai is issued against the Jews, the pasuk says like this. The last verse in chapter 3, V'hamelech v'Haman yoshvu lishtais. The king Achashverosh and Haman, may his memory be blotted out, they sit down to drink, to celebrate. V'ir Shushan avoicha, the city of Shushan is in confusion, is in a state of panic. Mordechai yodas kol hashana. So Mordechai knows everything that's going on. Vayikra, Mordechai is the God. Mordechai rents his garments, he puts on sackcloth and ashes, and he walks out in the city and he's screaming. And he's crying. Ze'oka gedoyla umora, a bitter and painful cry. The fate, the very existence of the Jewish people is hanging in the balance. Mordechai feels personally responsible here. Hot gezokta helika Berditchever, open your hearts, my friends. At gezokta helika Berditchever, the holy Rebbe of Berditchev said, there was a problem. And here it is. God, the Rebbeinu Shalom, was ready to bring a Hatzolah v'Yeshua for the Jewish people. The Rebbeinu Shalom was ready to do miracles unprecedented. Give the Jewish people a Yom Tov that they would celebrate for eternity. The Zichram lo Yosef Mizaram, even after all the other festivals would fall away, the Yom Tov of Purim would remain. The Rebbeinu Shalom was about to shower the Jewish people with love and with miracles and with kindness, and show the world that the Jewish people are his chosen nation, and kiss them and hug them in a way that would reverberate throughout eternity. No, so where are the miracles? Says the Burdicheva. In order for a Jew to experience a miracle of Hashem, the Jew has to be in a state of simcha. The Jew has to be in a state of joy. And in order for the enemies of the Jews to get their mapala, in order for them to be destroyed the way they're supposed to be, they have to be in a state of brokenness. They have to be in a state of melancholy. But here it's the other way around. Haman is sitting with the king, the anti-Semite, the Rasha, is sitting with the king drinking, celebrating. And the Jew is walking around the city crying and wearing sackcloth and ashes. His clothes are torn. In the Hasidic language, we call it, there's no keli. There's no keli means there isn't the appropriate vehicle in a spiritual sense through which Hashem's brachas should be manifest. This, says the Burdicheva, actually was the most dangerous moment in the Megillah. Not because the Jews' lives were in danger. The Gemara says the Jewish people's lives were never in danger. Hashem knew all along. It was only a show. Hashem knew all along that he was going to save them. There was no real danger for the Jewish people. The Jewish people needed a little reminder. Haman is nothing. Mordechais is nothing. Sounds garnished. There was no real danger here. You know when there was a moment of real danger? You know when there was actually a sakana? When the Hamans of the world are celebrating their besimcha, and the Mordechais of the world are walking around in sackcloth and ashes crying in the streets, and their clothes are torn, now you got a vulnerable moment. Hashem's brachas, says the Burdicheva, need an appropriate venue in which to take place. And for this, you need a Jew, a Yid, to be in a state of simcha, right? The analogy they give for this is a farmer davens to Hashem for rain. Hashem can make it rain. But if the farmer hasn't planted anything in his field, nothing's going to grow. Why is nothing going to grow? Because there's nothing to grow. The rain will come down on the field, but the field isn't a keli. The field can't do anything with that rain. You have to plant stuff. Only then does it work. Says the Berditchever, in order for Hashem's brachas to land in your life as a Yid, you need to be in a state of simcha. If you're walking around miserable and melancholy for the best reasons in the world, Hashem's brachas cannot be manifest in your life. Now we got a problem. We need to make Mordechai, we need to switch it. We need to get Haman depressed and Mordechai happy. How are we going to do that? Mordechai is in a state of deep pain over the fate of the future of the Jews, and Haman is king of the world. Okay, says the Megillah. An isolated, interesting, seemingly completely non-consequential event will happen. Achashverosh will remember that Mordechai saved his life. Haman will show up at that time and give a weird answer to the king that makes Achashverosh suspicious of Haman's answer, after Achashverosh is already not excited about the fact that Haman is invited to the private dinner between him and Esther. So Achashverosh, in a fascinating twist of divine providence, Achashverosh will tell will tell Haman to parade Mordechai around the streets on a horse. On a simple level, changes nothing. Haman is still the most powerful person in the world. Mordechai is still representing the Jews who've been sentenced to complete annihilation. So what changes? One thing, says the Burdicheva. One thing. For the duration of time that Mordechai sat on the horse and Haman paraded him around, there was a switch. Now Haman is depressed. Now Haman is humiliated. Now Haman's spirit has been broken and crushed. He's walking around the city like a loser. And Mordechai is in a state of simcha. Mordechai is in a state of joy. Clearly a kiddush Hashem. And at that moment, in a spiritual sense, the floodgates of Hashem's bracha open and the brachas come pouring through. It couldn't happen until Mordechai experienced a moment of simcha and Haman experienced a moment of sadness. And that's why, again, when the story of the parading of the horse is over, the Pasuk makes a point of saying that Haman returns home, quote, Ovel v'chafui rosh, in mourning and in shame. All right, the Medrash says he was in shame because of the garbage. He was in mourning because when his daughter saw that she had dumped the bucket of garbage on her own father, she jumped out the window, she killed herself. But the Burdicheva says it's more than that. It was the state of simcha that Mordechai was, so to speak, forced into, if but for a moment, while he sat there on top of the horse, that created the opening, the spiritual, removed the spiritual blockade. And from there, Hashem's brachas came pouring through. That's the word of the Burdicheva. What he's really saying is he's really saying this. He's saying, next time you and I find ourselves in a moment of challenge, next time you and I find ourselves in a moment of difficulty and pain, remember that as Jews, we're obligated to be joyous, to celebrate, even when things don't seem that way, and that the celebration, the mitzvah gedolah, this great mitzvah of being happy, liyas b'simcha tamid, actually opens up the channels of Hashem's brachas. Hashem says, I want to bless you. I want to save you. I want to give you everything that it is that you're asking for. But I can't do it if you're miserable. You need to experience at least but a moment of joy in order for this to open and in order to experience these miracles of Hashem. This may be, that's the insight of the Berditchever. Now here again, I want to add 2 cents of my own. This may be an insight into a very, very puzzling medrash. The medrash says that when Achashverosh told Haman to parade Mordechai around the streets on a horse, Haman begged him to not do that. Begged him not to. First, he made excuses. Haman says, I don't know who you're talking about. Right? Achashverosh told him, talking about Mordechai. Haman says, there are many Mordechais. Mordechai Yehudi. There's many Mordechai Yehudis. Hayoshe b'shar HaMelech, etc. Haman begged him not to. Haman said, please. Haman said, I'll give Mordechai money. I'll give him a province. I'll give him opportunity. I'll give him a river where he can collect taxes. Achashverosh says, I'll tapil dover mikol asher dibarto. Do all of that and parade him around on the horse. Listen to this. The Medrash says, at that point, Haman tells Achashverosh, okay, I'll revoke the decree. Forget it. Forget it, says Haman to Mordechai. Says Haman to Achashverosh. I take back what I said. I'll leave him alone. I won't sentence Mordechai to death. I won't sentence the entire Jewish nation to death. Forget it. I'll just go about it in mind. Let's go back to business as usual. And Achashverosh said, no. Put him on a horse and parade him around the streets. All right. And Haman does. And of course, again, as soon as he comes home and he tells his family what happens, his family tells him, you're finished, right? They told him, we might as well start planning your funeral. It's over. That means on some level, Haman and his family also understood this. They understood that even if but for a moment, Mordechai was put up on the horse, promoted and elevated in front of the entire kingdom, and would be paraded down the street in honor as a Kiddush Hashem, all it takes is just that crack and trach. The whole thing would be finished. And Haman begs Achashverosh, please don't force me into this. And Achashverosh, who already can tell that Haman is not loyal to him, forces him into it. And this is exactly what happened. In other words, the Burdicheva is saying that it was necessary for there to be a turning of the tide in a spiritual sense, which of course the Torah articulates by the story of Mordechai being paraded around, right? Even in the way we read the Megillah, the way we experience the story, the tide turns here. Even though in the beginning when the tide turns, it's non-consequential. Mordechai is on the horse, but he's still sentenced to death. But once he experienced a little bit of simcha, says the Burdicheva, from there the rest of Hashem's brachas flowed. All right, one more. Very, very famous. This is also a very famous insight. This one, the third one, comes from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. What's the last thing the Torah tells us about Mordechai? The final verse that we read says, Mordechai HaYehudi was actually appointed, Mordechai the Jew was appointed to be the Mishnah L'Melech Achashverosh. He was appointed to be Achashverosh's viceroy. He was second in command over all 127 countries. V'godol HaYehudim, he was great for the Jews. Again, he had literally, single-handedly, him and Esther, saved their lives. V'rotzei l'roi v'echov, and most of his brothers liked him. He sought only good for his people. He spoke peacefully to his children, etc. Of course, the part of the verse that jumps out at us is the fact that the Torah makes it clear to us that most of his brothers liked him. Most of his brothers, not all of his brothers, the Gemara says, some of the members of the Sanhedrin disassociated themselves from Mordechai. They felt that Mordechai was not correct in something he was doing. What did they not like? Well, it turns out, again, briefly, it turns out that there were some members of the Sanhedrin who felt that Mordechai should no longer be associated with somebody like Achashverosh. They said, it's time to leave the politics. A rabbi doesn't belong in a political position like that. They said, come back to yeshiva, come back to kollel, pull out a Gemara, learn Torah like everybody else. Where were you hanging out in the palace with Achashverosh? Achashverosh is a drunkard, he's a womanizer. I mean, the stuff that goes on in the palace. They said a Jewish boy doesn't belong. Okay. So the question is, says the Rebbe, the question is on Mordechai himself. What was Mordechai thinking? After all, at this point, Haman is dead. His sons are dead. The anti-Semites, the Torah makes it clearly, the Jews stood up on the 13th day of Adar in Shushan, also on the 14th day of Adar, and wiped them all out. So there's no more danger. Why is Mordechai hanging out in the king's palace? Mishnah Lamelech Achashverosh, he's the viceroy, and he dresses the way it's appropriate for a viceroy to dress, and he holds court, and in the court of Achashverosh. Achashverosh is a Rosh Merusha. Achashverosh is, I mean, you know, Achashverosh is who Achashverosh is, you know, the kind of guy who parties for 180 days, and then when that's over, makes another party for 7 days, and on the 7th day asks his wife to show up. I mean, that's the kind of guy Achashverosh is. So the question is, once the decree passed, why is Mordechai still there? So the Rebbe said, you know why? Because of the first thing that Rashi says on the entire Megillah. The first commentary of Rashi, Achashverosh, who Achashverosh, Rashi says, Hu Burdicheva mitchilosei vad sofer. Mordechai knew that Achashverosh could not be trusted. True, Haman was dead. True, his sons were dead. True, many of the anti-Semites were dead. But Achashverosh himself couldn't be trusted. Mordechai knew that. And so Mordechai said, as long as I'm alive, I'm going to be one heartbeat away from Achashverosh. So that if another Haman arises, or if someone else shows up, or the wind starts to blow in a different direction, the Gemara says Achashverosh was a hafchefachon, means he was the kind of guy who changed his mind very easily. Mordechai said, I know the nature of Achashverosh. He's still a hidden anti-Semite. I still got to watch him. All right, it seems like the majority of the rabbis understood that. The minority of the rabbis didn't necessarily understand the danger that Mordechai saw. Okay, fine. This is the way the Megillah concludes. Says the Rebbe, all right, let me ask you a question. Granted, it's true, Mordechai understood, he still needed to be there. Most of the other rabbis also understood it, some didn't, some felt rabbis shouldn't hold those kinds of positions. But let me ask you a different question, says the Rebbe. Why is this the conclusion of the entire Megillah? The entire Megillah. Really? When it's all over, and this man and his wife, Esther, are single-handedly responsible for literally saving the lives of every Jew. Why is the last thing the Megillah says, most of the Jews liked him? Imagine, right? Most of the community likes him. Most of the people think he's a good guy, but not all. Some people think, you know, he's a no-goodnik. That's the last thing you say about Mordechai. That's how the whole story of the Megillah concludes. That most people thought he was good. Why? If it needs to be said, so say it, 6 psukim before the end. And finish with a bang. Say he was Mishnah Lamelech, he was Gadol HaYehudim, he was Doirish Tov, such beautiful things. And right in there, right the last verse, we say it all out loud. The kind of Torah kind of like sticks it to him, yeah. But some of the Jews, in Yiddish we say, gemacht mit noz. You know what it means? They're gemacht mit noz. They were sitting sniffling in the back. Yeah. They weren't impressed with Mordechai after all he had done. Why is that the last thing the Torah says? And the Rebbe said, you know why? I'll tell you why. There are individuals whom everybody loves. There are individuals whom nobody has a bad word to say about them. They never ruffle any feathers. They never upset anybody. They never do anything that earns criticism from anybody. You know who those people are? People who do nothing. People who do nothing never get criticized because there's nothing to criticize about. In fact, everybody likes them because they make everybody else who does nothing feel comfortable as well. If you're going to get up and do something, if you're going to get up and say something, if you're going to make your mark, even if it's going to be literally saving the lives of every single Jew, no exceptions, you're going to get criticized for it. Somebody's going to get up and say, a rabbi shouldn't speak that way. A rabbi shouldn't do that. A rabbi shouldn't hang out in those kinds of circles. Somebody's going to say, this man didn't behave as he was supposed to. Somebody's going to say, we disapprove. It doesn't matter, says the Rebbe. The Torah concludes, Rotzoi leroiv echov. Most of his brothers liked him. He was the one who was responsible for single-handed, for him and Esther, saving all of Klal Yisrael. The Torah will give him credit for what it is that he did. But not all the Jews will. It's just the way Hashem made the world. Somebody is going to get up there and criticize. Even Mordechai HaYehudi. May Hashem bless us as we celebrate the Yom Tov of Purim. May Hashem bless us that as we celebrate this incredible time of year, so filled with mitzvahs and opportunities and simchas, that we go from strength to strength, that we always remember the examples of Mordechai and Esther, what they taught us, to be strong and proud Jews, to stand up to the Hamans of the world and never bow and never kneel, and to remember HaKadosh Baruch Hu Matzileinu Miyodam. Hashem will always save us from their hands. Please God, with the coming of Mashiach, may it be speedily in our days. Have a wonderful Shabbos.